Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is Hassan Munir from the MSA of York University in Toronto, Canada. And we're continuing our class on Islamic history. For those who were part of this class last semester and are now wondering, why it's going to be pre-recorded and posted online, the reason for that is that it would just be a lot more convenient for me to do it this way and to be able to do it more regularly, inshallah. And also it would be more beneficial for everyone since it's now available on demand. So if you can't actually make it to the class, you can still join in and benefit from it. The disadvantage, of course, is that we can't have as much, person-to-person interaction as we did when it was a physical class. But if you do have any questions, if you do have any comments, anything of the sort, feel free to message me, send me an email, comment wherever you see this video, and inshallah it'll get to me. On the flip side, the advantage is that we can now have a class on a weekly basis instead of a bi-weekly basis, since I have a bit more flexibility in just recording this class and uploading it. For those who are watching this class for the first time, welcome, and on behalf of the York MSA, I hope you will find it beneficial. What we do in this class is to take a very broad and complex topic in Islamic history every week and try to introduce it in such a way that a person who's interested could then go on and develop their understanding of that topic further on their own. So, though what you learn in this class is based on academic sources and it is based on reasonable and responsible interpretation, I only present it as food for thought, and I encourage you to further study, of course, any subjects that pique your interest. And if you need any help with that, if you're not sure of where to get started, anything of the sort, please feel free to reach out to me, and I would be happy to help you with that. That being said, our topic for today's class is what is commonly called the Golden Age of Islamic Science. This refers to the period from about the year 750, when the Abbasid dynasty came into power, to the year 1258, when the Mongols destroyed the Abbasid capital of Baghdad. Now, obviously, these dates are very arbitrary, and within this period of 500 years, there were a lot of ups and downs, a lot of development. But there's still something that we can work with for the level that we're learning at right now. Before I go on, I do want to mention that the topic that we're discussing today is very relevant. There's a lot of curiosity about it. There are a lot of questions, a lot of paradigms, a lot of explanations about it, about this whole idea of Islamic science. And so it ought to be obvious to anyone that there's no way that I could possibly address every aspect of this topic in one short class, even if I did have all the answers. And I don't have all the answers, though I am slowly trying to work towards, having some kind of cohesive, thorough understanding of all the questions that people have about the subject. But again, the point is, for this class, this is just food for thought. I'm open to any criticism about things I may miss or something I may not consider, but please keep it constructive. Now, I'm going to break the class down into 4 parts. In the first part, we're going to briefly talk about the scientific achievements of this period generally and the historical events that affected them. In the second part, we're going to talk about a very interesting theory about the rise and fall of Islamic science outlined by a modern-day scholar named Yadullah Kazmi. In the third part, we'll look at very briefly at some of the brightest scientists and thinkers in Islamic history, keeping in mind that I can hardly go into any detail at all given the time constraint. And in the last part, we'll explore this idea of Muslims passing on their scientific knowledge to the West. So here we go. As I said, this golden age of Islamic science is generally said to have lasted from the year 750 to 1258. In 750, the Abbasid dynasty came into power in Iraq, and they would soon build a new capital city for their empire named Baghdad. The Abbasids were heavily influenced by Persian culture. And if you know anything about Persian history, you know that for the better part of 1,000 years, they've had a very rich intellectual and cultural history. I'm not just talking about the people, of Iran today, but also the Persian cultures of Central Asia, and the general sphere of Persian influence in that region. Now, as we'll discuss later on, Islam only enriched the spirit of intellectual activity that the Persians were already familiar with and gave that spirit a new purpose. This is not to diminish the achievements of non-Persians in the Golden Age, but it's also a fact that the intellectual and scientific activity that happened in this early period flourished most under Persian administrators, Persian-influenced caliphs, and also that many of the scientists and thinkers who became most prominent were of Persian origin. Now, many of the early Abbasid caliphs were very well educated themselves, and they brought Persian advisors and viziers to their court in Baghdad. These guys patronized much of the work that was done in this period. And at first the work was very practical because the expanding Muslim empire had a lot of logistical problems that had to be solved. So the fields of math and astronomy and medicine, those three in particular, were where a lot of early activity happened. All of this was facilitated by paper coming into the Muslim world from China, where it was first developed. In the year 750, the same year that the Abbasids came into power, they fought and won a battle against a Chinese army at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia. Now, it's said, though this isn't confirmed, that some of the Chinese prisoners of war who were brought back by the Abbasid army to Baghdad were experts in paper making, and so they introduced this skill to the Muslim world. And within decades, very rapidly, there were paper factories in many of the major cities of the empire, and there were entire roads in the city of Baghdad that were just lined with bookstores. It was a revolution, kind of like the invention of the printing press, or something like the invention of the internet closer to our times. And this also helped what became known as the translation movement. As many non-Muslims came to live in the Muslim empire, since they weren't forced to convert to Islam, they realized that the new rulers had a general appreciation for knowledge, regardless of where it was coming from. Especially the Christians of Syria, who could speak and write in Arabic, and they had contacts in the Byzantine Empire. They started to take advantage of this by bringing knowledge of the Greeks and translating it into Arabic. And the translation movement, quickly became so huge, and such, the industry of its day, that I've heard it said that a good translator of the time could make a salary that's comparable to what professional athletes get paid today, which is pretty amazing. Unlike many of today's athletes, LeBron, they actually deserved it too. And over time, this golden age expanded to include other scientific fields and many of the fields that we now call the social sciences. However, an important thing to keep in mind is that the more knowledge you take in from any kind of source that is foreign to your culture or foreign to your community or your worldview, the more knowledge you take in from that, the more you have to adopt foreign ways of thinking to understand that knowledge in its own context. Now, that's an effort that we can admire, but it's also a very dangerous thing to try to do, as we'll discuss a bit later. There's a lot of risks involved with that. And before we move on to the next part, so I mentioned there's 4 parts to the class. Before we move on to the part 2, I just want to mention 2 more points here. First, the role of networking in the golden age of Islamic science. There was a lot of networking that happened between scientists and thinkers, some of whom probably never even met each other. An example is a very interesting debate that Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, both of whom are regarded as 2 of the greatest thinkers in history, this little debate that they had, despite never meeting each other, but they were writing letters to each other for a very long period of time, just going back and forth and exchanging knowledge, debating knowledge. And what's often overlooked is the role that the Hajj played in this. Now, Hajj, as most of us probably know, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and Muslims are obliged to do the Hajj, to perform the Hajj once in their lifetime. So this led to the Hajj becoming what I would call the original marketplace of ideas. There's this concept in liberalism of the marketplace of ideas, where ideas can come in, they can be introduced, they can be expanded on, they can be challenged, they can be thrown out if they're not valuable, they can be developed, people can play around with them, etc. You get the idea. And the Hajj is this one central place in the Hijaz and Mecca and Medina where Muslims are coming from all over the Muslim world, and they're gathering. And in those days when people went for Hajj, it took years for them to get from one place to another. And coming from somewhere like Spain or India, those kind of faraway places to Mecca, it took a while. So you went through a lot of the Muslim world slowly. You met a lot of people. You heard a lot about what kind of activity, cultural and scientific, was going on in that area. And then when you got to the Hajj itself, you met so many people there from so many different parts of the world. And many scholars, when they went there, they decided to stick around for a year or two just to benefit from, the marketplace of ideas, basically, just to benefit from that opportunity. And there are actual documented cases where we can see this happening. One of my favorite ones, in which I wrote an article on, I think last year, was a case of Muslim physicians in Spain discussing being very familiar, and you can see this in their discussion. They were very familiar with the research of Muslim scientists in India who were doing it at the same time. So this is research happening in a very different part of the world at the same time, but they are aware of it all the way in Spain. It's pretty amazing, considering there's no instant communication. It's not a globalized world in the sense that we understand it today, but this kind of networking is still happening. This kind of spread of knowledge is still happening. Finally, a comment on the importance of stability. Stability is good for, scientific thinking, for science. When a person doesn't have to worry about his life, being at risk, or about putting food on the table, he or she can comfortably think about the mysteries of the universe or the complexity of the human body. Now, in the early days of Abbasid rule, political stability created, a situation in which intellectual activity could flourish. And you can see, as you read, about this golden age, that as things became more economically unstable, politically unstable, ending with the disastrous events of the Crusades and the Mongol destruction of half the Muslim world, intellectual activity declined alongside that. Okay, so now we'll discuss an interesting theory about the rise and fall of Islamic science. This theory was explained by a researcher named Yadullah Kazmi, and I'm sharing it with you not because I feel like it is the explanation, of course, but because it's a unique approach that you're unlikely to find in most books by historians of science who talk about the subject. So let's dive right into it. Kazmi doesn't use the terms Golden Age or Islamic science. He calls it the culture of learning. A culture of learning, briefly, is a cultural setting in which scholarly activity is socially meaningful and rewarding. And this culture affects the activities of the people living in it, in many ways. And it has certain roots that make it distinct from similar cultures in other times and places. So for comparison, maybe we could describe our culture today as a culture of materialism, or maybe a culture of expression. And these two defining aspects of our culture affect everything we do while living within it, regardless of whether or not we agree with it or not. And that being said, here's the gist of Kazmi's argument and, of course, my interpretation of it. The Quran is an open book, in that Muslims are encouraged to understand the Quran, with reference to the external world. And, this is not a difficult concept to grab. I mean, in elementary school, we used to do this exercise where we'd read a book and then we would be asked to relate, reflect, and respond to what we had read. And the Quran asks us to do something similar. It asks us to reflect on the stars, the bee, the development of the human embryo, the fact that two bodies of water run into each other but their water does not mix. All those topics that we now call the scientific miracles of the Quran. But the Quran is not a scientific textbook. It simply uses scientific knowledge as an external, observable reference point by which humans can recognize a truth, a reality that goes beyond what science or rationality can tell us on their own. So Islam doesn't discourage scientific discovery, but it does attach a compass to it to give it a trans-scientific purpose and vision, something that transcends science itself. So in this way, the Quran lays the roots for the development of a distinctly Islamic culture of learning. And of course, in alignment with that, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did so as well. And the most striking example for me is the case of the prisoners of war after the Battle of Badr. I can't go into the entire history of it, but this was a time in which the Muslims desperately needed money that would come from ransoming their prisoners of war after the battle. But the Prophet offered another option. He said that any of the captives who could teach 10 Muslim children how to read and write was free to go. Now, if you think about it, this is a society that is mostly illiterate, a society in which there is hardly any kind of material to write on, forget books. And a society in which people have a very sharp memory and don't need to write much down. If the only thing the Prophet wanted his followers to learn was the Quran and the Hadith, he was already aware that they could memorize those and pass them down orally from generation to generation, as by the way Muslims have done right up to our very day. Besides that, the Muslims needed the money since their own property was recently confiscated and sold by their enemies. So why offer this option of teaching 10 Muslim children how to read and write and then letting the person go? Why offer that option when there's hardly, anything to gain from it? Of course, the Prophet ﷺ was thinking for the long term. Eventually, he was preparing a generation of scholars who would start by develop the Islamic disciplines, but then as the generations went by, move outward into other fields of knowledge without ever letting go of that Islamic vision. Think about a tree with its roots. The Prophet ﷺ is sowing the seeds here to develop those roots, after which the tree can grow and branch off into different fields of knowledge while still maintaining that core essence, that source where it gets all its energy, its vitality from. All those branches get their vitality from the roots at the end of the day, and he is cultivating those roots by taking this step, even though at the time it may not make much sense in a short-term vision. And so this is how he's sowing the seeds for a culture of learning which is going to develop in early Islamic history. But then the question is, if this is how the culture of learning developed, within which all this scientific activity happened, then why did that culture decline? The reason, as I kind of hinted on earlier, is that with foreign knowledge come foreign ways of thinking. For example, and this is just one example, wherever Greek science went, and Muslims benefited from Greek science and they expanded on it, wherever Greek science went, Greek philosophy quickly followed, because you couldn't really understand everything that Greek science had to offer without also going into Greek philosophy. And over time, with all these new ideas, not just new knowledge, but new ways of thinking flowing into the Muslim world, the Quranic roots, I just described the tree, now, the Quranic roots of this Islamic culture of learning begin to be challenged by alternative ways of thinking. Again, if you go back to the metaphor of the tree, it's like, the leaves on the branches find a way to get all the nutrients, everything that they need, or they think they found that way, and they start going that way instead, and, don't feel the need to stay connected to the roots anymore. And of course, there's a reason we know that trees don't work like that. And in turn, what happens is the discipline of Quranic studies, the way the Quran was understood, it became more defensive and it became more insulated. The external references became cut off. The connection never completely disappeared between someone reading the Quran and the external world that they were asked to refer to by the Quran. That connection was still kind of there, but it was significantly weakened. And the Quran instead started to be understood with reference to itself rather than the external world. So, for example, a field that really emerged during this period, it really grew during this period, is linguistic analysis of the Quran. This is also when we really see the development of, these debates between, the Zahir and the Batin, the explicit interpretation of the Quran and the implicit and the hidden and the apparent, these tensions, because people are now looking more at the Quran inwardly, because when you start making external reference, we've had knowledge come in from foreign societies that's brought foreign ways of thinking, that if you go into external references, then there's an interference there that's happening. And so, in other words, the Quran-based vision hadn't been what had been holding back science. It had actually been the driving force of the whole culture of learning in which science flourished, right? And when that vision was abandoned, when the connection with the roots, was weakened, science experienced a decline as well. And, the thing that we also have to remember is that instability was the nail in the coffin. We discussed stability a bit earlier. Instability is not good for intellectual activity, for scientific activity, because, first of all, there's all kinds of destruction of the infrastructure that promotes science. I mean, Baghdad was kind of the center of Islamic learning for a very long time, including scientific learning, and Baghdad was completely destroyed. The libraries were destroyed. Much of the infrastructure was destroyed when the Mongols came in 1258. And again, when people have things to worry about, when people have their lives on the line, when people aren't sure whether there's going to be food on the table or not, there isn't much time for you to explore all these different fields of science. You have to do whatever you need to do, to preserve your life first, to preserve your life and safety first. So instability, which became, it just increased after the first century or so of the Abbasid dynasty's rule. The empire starts to fragment, then there's fighting within between the different fragments, and then external forces start to come in, the Crusaders come in, and there's this general decline happening, never really having a chance to recover. As we said, there's also this different ways of thinking that are also challenging the way this entire culture had once worked. And the nail in the coffin at the end, at least for a significant part of the golden age of Islamic science, was the Mongol invasions, and they completely decimated the whole Persian sphere of influence, and the center point, Baghdad and Iraq itself. Now, to move quickly, into part 3, which is discussing some of the key figures, the key thinkers and scientists involved, in everything that we've been talking about. I'm going to keep it very brief, just give you the highlight reel. Because there's just so much detail that I would love to go into. There's so much detail that I haven't even yet learned and I need to learn, and there's very limited time. So I'm just going to discuss some of the major thinkers, and then make a point about certain fields that we usually don't think of as science, but which were still nevertheless very important in this culture of learning in early Islamic society. So, I mean, mathematics, I'm sure this is the part where you start hearing names that you're more familiar with. Al-Khwarizmi, practically every Muslim, anywhere knows this story of how the word algebra comes from the Arabic word al-jabr, because it was part of the title of a book that al-Khwarizmi wrote. His actual name is where the word algorithm comes from. And he essentially created algebra as we know it. There's Umar Khayyam, who maybe some of us know more as a poet, but again, major developments in algebra, for example, like equations of different degrees. In the field of optics, Ibn al-Haytham is a very interesting figure. The first person that we know of, the first person in recorded history to accurately explain how vision works, how we see, and light bounces off an object and is directed to my eyes, and that's how I can see. And all kinds of implications of this. The camera I am using right now to film this would probably not exist if it wasn't for the work of Ibn al-Haytham. His book of optics, just to show you the influence. Now, he lived around more than 1,000 years ago, but his book of optics, which is where he describes all this functioning of the eyes and vision, etc. It was read by Leonardo da Vinci. It was read by René Descartes. It was read by Galileo Galilei. It was read by Johannes Kepler. So these are the leading thinkers, the leading scientists of Western civilization, of medieval Europe, and they've all read this person's book, the Book of Optics, even though for some of them it wasn't necessarily their field. I mean, René Descartes, but this book was so influential that, and it was such a monumental work that they are still reading it, and this is, most of these guys lived like 500-600 years after Ibn al-Haytham was long gone from this world. And two very interesting things about Ibn al-Haytham is are that, first of all, he's considered the pioneer of the scientific method itself. The scientific method as we understand it today, about setting a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, recording the results, and then the theory behind that this same process should be, it should be able to be replicated if someone else tries it somewhere else under the same conditions. So he's a pioneer of that. He emphasized that, the importance of it. And what's very interesting is that that's one way he's described. Another way that he is described is that he's a very devout Muslim. There's even a quote, I don't remember the exact quote, so don't quote me on this, but he is saying practically that what we were discussing earlier, that the point of all this knowledge, all this scientific work that he's doing is ultimately to affirm a higher truth, which is the reality, as we said, of our existence, the reality of God, the reality of God's deen, right? Which is very interesting, and I really want to go in my own research more into depth about how, or whether anyone has kind of seen this as a tension between him being the world's first true scientist, because he kind of introduced the scientific method, and him also being a very devout Muslim. In the field of medicine, Ibn Sina, who we mentioned earlier, a huge figure. His canon of medicine was still being used in European universities in 1650, and again, this is centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years after he died. But there's just so many achievements, and I'm sure I'm not even aware of all of them, but Ibn Sina is one of those polymaths, and that's the other thing to remember. A lot of these guys, in fact pretty much all of them, were polymaths. They not only worked in more than one field, they specialized in multiple fields. So very ambitious, because again, it's a culture of learning. There's nothing better you can do. There's nothing more rewarding you can do. There's nothing that will be recognized more than what you can do in the fields of knowledge. But I also want to talk about, non-scientific fields that sometimes don't come up in the discussion when we talk about what Muslim scientists achieved. So there's significant achievements, and you have to recognize what they all contribute to the broader collection of knowledge that we have. So cultural studies is often ignored completely, as if, and it leads some people to think that Muslims just don't care about culture, and that whole thing we talk about nowadays of Islam versus culture, where we just make it into a duality. It's like it's either this or that, where that's not the case. Muslims are very cultural people. They've always been very interested in culture. And in the field of cultural studies, we have pioneering people like Ibn Wahshiyya, who, again, more than 1,000 years ago, he deciphered half of all the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs because he was very interested in the hieroglyphs and what they meant. You guys know the hieroglyphs like all over the Egyptian pyramids and temples from ancient times, and he deciphered all of them. And the credit all goes to Napoleon's army and Jean-Francois Champollion, who did it in the 19th century. And he did it, he does deserve credit because he deciphered essentially all of them, but half of them had been deciphered almost like, 800-900 years earlier. And then Al-Biruni, who we also mentioned earlier in the field of Indology, or the study of Indian civilization, he's actually considered the founder of that study. An interesting thing about Al-Biruni, by the way, there's multiple historians of science who consider him the greatest thinker in general, the greatest thinker between ancient times and the Renaissance. I mean, even if you forget the fact that, hey, ancient times and the Renaissance, is it just because they're like, we don't really have any person of our own during that period, and the ancients were really brilliant, and so were the Renaissance people, so let's pick a guy in between, right? It might be that, but even if you disregard that, you can still see that out of so many people in medieval times, in those 800 years known as Europe's Dark Ages, or the Islamic, Golden Age, or China's flourishing of science, or whatever, he's considered the greatest thinker out of all of them. Indian civilization is one of the subjects he was very interested in, and which he studied, in depth and wrote about. And it wasn't even his main specialization. He specialized in so many other things, even a longer list than his debating partner Ibn Sina, that at some point I would really love to maybe do an entire class just on this person named Al-Biruni. And in sociology, Ibn Khaldun, who came later, who actually came after the Mongol invasions, he's considered the father of the field of sociology. He's considered the father of the social sciences field of demography. His Muqaddimah is considered a classic, the famous quoted by Ronald Reagan, and Reaganomics and all that, the connection that's quite popular for the people who are in the field. And there's so many other figures in art, in architecture, in inventors, people who weren't necessarily theoretical thinkers but actually applied. Abbas ibn Firnas and the prototype, the flying machine and all that kind of thing. Political science, Ibn Zafar al-Sikili is a political thinker who essentially wrote the same book as Niccolo Machiavelli, but he did it before Machiavelli. Machiavelli, if you don't know, is considered the father of political science because he wrote an empirically grounded political guide for a ruler. So something based on something based on empirical facts. But there's an Arab guy who wrote essentially the exact same book, several decades, or actually no, several centuries earlier, and doesn't show up in the picture. So the point here is that there's so many of these people who, and certain categories of them have been picked out by historians of science, and they're discussed in detail and what they believed, etc. But there's still so many that we don't know about, and there's emerging research, and really reading about them is so inspiring. I would just encourage everyone to figure out what your field is, which field you like to work in, what your career is in, what you do, and go back and, or ask someone who could help you to find maybe some inspirational figures from the past and see how they approach the same field that you work in today. You never know, maybe they founded the field that you work in today. Now, the last thing I want to discuss in this class is, the last point out of the 4 that we were going to focus on in this class is this idea of the transfer of knowledge, all this scientific knowledge and other knowledge as well that Muslim civilization had developed during its golden age, transferring of all of that to the West, to Europe, and from there it was further developed. Now, this is something that a lot of Muslims today express a lot of pride in. And there's a straightforward reason for that, is because a lot of these Muslims are young Muslims trying to figure out, second generation immigrants or first generation immigrants, trying to figure out their place in the West. They're having a bit of an identity crisis, and it's, a way to respond to that is to, say that we're Western, and part of our Westernness is not only that we live here, that we call this place home, that we pay taxes, that we're just as much active citizens of these societies as anyone else, but also that we have a long history of contributing to these societies, and everything these societies are based on, the traditions of science, the traditions of rational thought, and all of that. Muslims at some point made a very, very significant contribution to that, which is all true, which is all, I'm not saying that it's not true, but to be proud of this history is, it's not enough. And I have a difficult time articulating this because this is the point that I very keenly want to get across, because, from an Islamic perspective, when we learn something, the first thing we focus on is how we can apply it to our lives. So when we learn about this transfer of knowledge, first this knowledge was developed in the culture of learning, but just as the culture of learning was declining, the Crusades happened. Europeans came into the Muslim world. There was a lot more interaction. They kind of interacted with Muslims. They kind of interacted with the world that the Muslims had created and a world that they had never experienced back home in Europe. And they took a lot of ideas, they took a lot of knowledge back with them. And then other people started coming as well as Islam spread into the Mediterranean. Many people, of course, because Islam was the Muslims were in the ruling majority in Spain for the longest time. For almost 800 years, there was a lot of interaction with other European peoples, from there. So there's a lot of spheres of interaction, just as the culture of learning in Muslim civilization is declining, and Muslims kind of pass off the torch. And people like Copernicus, I already mentioned how Da Vinci and Galileo were reading like Ibn al-Haytham's book of optics. Copernicus was relying on the star charts that Muslim astronomers had made. Some of these major names in European science and European rational thought, people like Francis Bacon are influenced. People like René Descartes, as we mentioned earlier, are influenced. But the point is, again, apart from trying to demonstrate this sense of belonging to Western civilization, this sense of, contribution to Western civilization, what can we practically apply of this knowledge that we have about, Islamic science being passed on to the West? And the key to answering that question is in a certain aspect of that story that's often, brushed aside or not paid much attention to, or people don't even realize that it exists. And that is the role of the Europeans themselves. See, a lot of when Islam was at its, or not Islam, I should say, when this Muslim culture of learning was at its peak, Europeans were very curious about this knowledge that the Muslims had, about the way Muslims lived, and they would come, they would make the long journey, they would come, they would spend many years in the Muslim world learning the languages, learning the knowledge, and once they had gained that, they would then go back to their own countries, and when they got there, they would translate that knowledge into the vernacular languages of Europe, and they would be challenged for that knowledge, not only because of its foreign source, but also because it may contradict with the teachings of the dominant force in Europe at the time, which was the Roman Catholic Church. And some of them paid the ultimate sacrifice for bringing that knowledge from the Muslim world into Europe, right? They burned at the stake, tried and executed in the Inquisition, etc. Anyone who studies European history, medieval history, is familiar with this. Now, for Muslims today, it's amazing how neatly the situation has been reversed. Today, it's the same for us. Today, the peak of the culture of learning is in the West. So our parents are bringing us here, or we're bringing ourselves here. We're making the long journey, letting go of a lot of things, abandoning a lot of things to come here. To learn here, to study here. A lot of parents, if you ask them why they brought us here, if I ask my parents why they brought me here, it's for education, for a better education. And a lot of immigrants' parents, would say the same. And, giving us opportunities here, basically, that we wouldn't have had wherever we came from. Just like when people like Adelard of Bath, who is a very famous bridge between Muslim civilization, he's a person, a very famous bridge between Muslim civilization and Europe. He took a lot of, Muslim knowledge. He's the first person to introduce the Hindu-Arabic system of numerals into the European world, right? And so today you and I have the potential to be the Adelard of Bath, because we've come in to the West and we're studying here and we're benefiting from here and we're contributing here as well. And there's nothing wrong with contributing here, but we're losing sight of what we're leaving behind and how much they need us to give something back to them out of the opportunities that we have here. See, we have opportunities that people in Pakistan, people in Saudi Arabia, people in Egypt, people in Turkey, Afghanistan, people in Nigeria, those people do not have. Opportunities for education. So if we come here and we just, what they say, like draw the lines and just, plan to stay here, and not take any of the benefits of the knowledge we gain here back to those countries. And I know the situation is bad, and I know there's sacrifices that have to be made if you want to, be that bridge, just like Adelard of Bath was. But that is how you revive a Muslim civilization. We're in the kind of way of thinking now that it's a globalized world, it's just a global village, there's no such thing as civilizations and things anymore. There's a much deeper discussion to have about that, and I would argue that civilizations very much still exist. They're not in some kind of clash of civilizations, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. But if we want to revive the Muslim world, instead of sitting here and we all complain about the politics of the Muslim world, sitting on Twitter or sitting on Facebook and talking about the situation here and how people have primitive ways of thinking there and all that stuff. But if we actually want to give back, if we actually want to contribute something, then we have to decide whether we're going to take the knowledge that we have here, take the skills that we gain here, take the opportunities that we have here, and use them to benefit the people we left behind. And not have this escapist mentality that we escaped and they didn't. And so, it's their fault that they didn't get a chance to escape. We're going to live a better life here and they can live whatever life they want back home. We have to find ways to contribute, and a lot of people played a lot of sacrifice in Europe to revive Europe, to make the Renaissance happen, and the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, and then modern society where Western civilization dominates. It dominates for a reason, because there are a lot of people who made a lot of sacrifices, and when it came to Muslims transferring their knowledge to the West, it wasn't as much that Muslims transferred their knowledge, it's that they came, they took it, and they took it back to where they came from, and then they played with it, and they made something out of it. They used it to revive their civilization. So that's a role that we need to have if we're serious about any kind of revival of the Muslim Ummah at a global level. That's the kind of role that we need to play. We need to take our knowledge and skills, as we said, take it back to where we came from. So thank you for listening. This is it for the class. I touched on a lot of things. I didn't really get a chance to go into detail in very many of them. It's just a super broad topic that you could talk about forever and forever. There's books written about it. There's so much debates that happen about it, but there's still not very many conclusions that people agree on. There's just so much to discuss, and in the scope of a class, there's only so much I could do. But I feel like I did get some food for thought across, and I hope you will benefit from it. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them wherever you find this video. I'm sure they'll get back to me, or just send me an email at ihistory, so that's IHISTORY co at gmail.com, and I'll try to get back to you, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, and assalamu alaikum.